like JavaScript is known as an object-oriented program, so objects are incredibly important. If the name didn't give it away, it's also by far probably the most common data type that you will see in the real world, because of kind of how powerful it is and how encapsulating how much data and data varieties it can hold. So, what is an object? I'm just actually minimize the screen really quick here so I can actually see you all. Okay. Um, so one of the ways, so in JavaScript, we call something an object. In Python, the equivalent of it would be called a dict, D-I-C-T, which is short for a dictionary. And actually, a dictionary is actually a really, really good way, a really good metaphor for thinking about objects. In the same way that a dictionary is just a collection of words and their definitions, an object is just a collection of keys and their values, right? So when we think about a dictionary, the idea is I have a bunch of words. If I want to know what that word means, I would go to the dictionary and I will look up that word, right? The word identifies, or it helps me find the definition. In the same vein, an object in JavaScript is a collection of key value pairs. So what that means is when I go into an object, I basically have a key in mind and I'm looking for the value of that key. So just like arrays, object can store values, and also just like arrays, it can store any types of values that you want. It can store booleans, numbers, strings, arrays, or even other objects, which we'll talk more about tomorrow. In arrays, we actually also had keys, except we didn't really call them keys, right? We call them indexes or indices. Because if you think about the way you access a particular element in an array, you would say, hey, go to the sixth element or the sixth index. I'm sorry, go to the sixth index and get me the element there. We're almost doing the exact same thing in an object in JavaScript, except rather than having everything be a numerical index, rather than having everything have an order, in an object, we actually can say, hey, everything I need, it won't be a numerical index, it will be a string key. And that brings us to like the first kind of rather inflexible part of JavaScript objects, which is that every key has to be a string. We can't have a number as a key. We can't have a boolean as a key. We can't have another object or array as a key. We have to have a string as a key. But the value for that key can be any data type you want, right? So once again, if you go back to the analogy of a dictionary, for a English dictionary to work, let's say, we assume that every word you're looking up has to be a word, right? A string. The definition for that word can be a picture, or a graph, or words, or numbers, or anything else. That's fine. But in order for the dictionary to kind of work out of the box, every word has to be a string. It's the same exact concept here. So in the first bullet, the one thing to notice is the fifth word there, unordered. In arrays, order matters a lot. There's a very clear sequence in arrays in a list in terms of what comes first, second, next. In objects or JavaScript, you can kind of think of it as unordered, as in the order doesn't really matter. Or put another way, if you want order to matter, then you shouldn't be using an object. You should be using an array. Okay, so just think of an object as a collection of a bunch of values, and we're able to get to any value we want, but there's no sense of order. So in that way, it's a little bit different from a traditional dictionary. And then in the second bullet, once again, the key thing to notice there is that every key in a JavaScript object has to be a string. So in this example here, you'll notice line 6, we have a typical array. By now, we should be pretty familiar with that. But from line 8 to 11, we created an object. Notice how the object begins with a curly brace and ends with a curly brace. So this is basically the base syntax for how to create an object. And then on lines 9 and 10, notice how we have key 1, value 1. That will associate value 1 with key 1 in this particular object. And notice how for each key value pair that we call it, we separate them by a comma, which happens at the end of line 9. So my object is an object. It has two keys. It has two key value pairs. The first key value pair is key 1, and the value for that is value 1 because key 1 value 1. That denotes that that's a pairing. And we have comma and we say another key value pair is key 2 as a key, colon, and then value 2 is associated with key 2. And we access it the same exact way that it's almost identical to how we access it with arrays, whereas now instead of passing in an index or a number, we're passing in a string. So on line 14 there, notice how in order to access value 1, I say, hey, my object, give me the value at your key 1 key. Make sense so far? Cool. This is very, very like fundamental. Like this is the part where if you have any questions, like definitely ask as soon as possible, because this is like basically the very, very core aspect of object. And if this doesn't make sense, then the next few slides will not make sense. Okay. So why are objects useful? For a variety of reasons. The most important one is in an array, we can actually store a lot of data, but there's nothing that tells us, that describes that data for us. There's nothing that gives us a clear sense of context for what that data is or kind of what it's representing. So arrays are good places to hold this, but an object is actually a lot more flexible, because through an object's key value pair association, for every value that we store in an object, the key, typically speaking, should be something that helps us also describe what that value is. So in this case, on line 2, I have something called pushing. It's a variable called pushing. I have an array. It has 3 values, which are pushing, 7, and gray and tabby. Looking at it, I have no idea what those 3 values are. But if I was to put this in object format, notice how for pushing, it's once again an object with 3 values. The first key is name, and the value for it is pushing. So almost from like a comfort level, it tells me that pushing is a type of name, comma, the second key value is age 7, so it tells me that 7 is associated with the age key, and then lastly, gray and tabby is associated with the color key. Oh. So this is probably one of the main reasons why objects are really useful, is because they not only let you store a lot of data, a lot of maybe potentially unrelated data, but also gives you a way to access it very quickly, and it also gives you, and also through the key, it should hopefully give you a good sense of what you're looking at and the context for usage for the values. Okay, so here we go back to our old friend type of, and for type of an object, we get object. Once again, this is probably works for like 99% of the cases that you'll check. But just notice that an array, once again, also gives you an object. And the reason why, just kind of for your own knowledge, and less because it's something that you need to know technically, it's because even though we've treated arrays as kind of this very special thing so far, under the hood in JavaScript, an array actually is an object. It's just like a very complex object that they built with a bunch of pre-built-in features. So we use it like an array. But to JavaScript, at a very base level, an array is just an object. That's why when we do type of array, it gives us back object. Okay, so creating an object, very simple. Once again, we use the curly braces. An object's keys are always strings, so we can actually omit the quotation marks. So what does that mean? If I go back to a previous slide, notice how actually next one. Okay, notice how on lines 9 through 14, when I create my pushing object, notice how on lines 11, 12, and 13, I said name, I put in quotes to let you know that name is a string, it's a key, right? Age is a string and it's a key, and color is also a string and a key as well. Well, because JavaScript is actually very strict on their objects, and because it assumes by default that the only things that can be keys are strings, on lines 7, 8, and 9, even though I didn't put quotes around name, age, and color, JavaScript says it actually doesn't matter, because it has to be a string. So what I'll do is I'll actually convert that into a string for you. Okay, so here when you're first starting off, if you want to be safe, feel free to put quotes on there. But even if you don't put quotes, this is one of the few instances in JavaScript where it's just going to make the assumption for you that, oh, this is going to be a string as is. Okay. And then lastly, if I ever want to access a particular value, just like if I want to access a definition in a dictionary, all I got to do is go to the object, I use my bracket notation still, and I give it the key, and it gives me back the value, right? If I go to a dictionary, I give it the word, it gives me back the definition, right? You can also think of this as almost like a code check, like someone gives you like a tag with like a number on it. Here, all I'm doing is I'm going to the code check, I'm giving it a number, which in this case is the key, and it says, okay, great, this key, or in this case, this number is associated with this jacket. Here you go, right? Same exact idea. Any questions so far? So this is just Objects 101, very, very basic, and hopefully a lot of it you've already seen before in the pre-work or just kind of in your own work in JavaScript. Yep. On line 11? Yeah, we'll talk about that in a little bit. Go. Cool. All right. So that's basically how to create and how to access an object. And then the last thing just to note is kind of like how, you know how in an array, if I only have 3 things in my array and I say, hey, give me your 10th element, JavaScript doesn't throw an error, it gives you back undefined. It's the same exact behavior for an object. If I access a key that has not been created or is not valid in my object, I get back undefined. So no error, but it does give me back, a falsy value, I guess. Cool. So this is, I guess, answer your question, Charlie, of what happens when we pass in a variable into the key. So in this case, on line 12, on line 10, we create a variable called key to check, and we set it equal to the string name. So therefore, when we pass in a variable into the square brackets on line 12, JavaScript actually accesses that variable first. So here, once again, we're assuming it's a variable, not a string. The only place in this kind of lesson where we assume something is a string is when we're creating the object on lines 5 through 7. Otherwise, whenever we're trying to access it, JavaScript by default assumes everything in between the bracket is a variable, right? Unless, of course, you put quotes around it, in which case it knows that it's a string. So here on line 12, when we access key to check and pushing, it says, okay, great, what's key to check? Key to check is a variable. What's the value of the variable? It's this string name. So when I access pushing name, I get back pushing. And then similarly, I can also put an expression basically in between those square brackets too. So here I'm adding COL plus OR. And so it does that operation for me first to get color, and then it accesses the color key in pushing. I think I heard a question, or I heard, yeah. Yeah, so great question. So multiple objects having the same key is not an issue, because you know how pushing is the object. If you have multiple objects, then this is pushing 1, pushing 2, right? It's like you're looking up in different objects. So you're confused? Okay, so let's take a look here. So if I have here, let's say I have let comment out this. If I say let x equals this, and I have my name key, and I'll call this one Tom, and then I'll have this guy here, and then this name will be David. Even though both these objects have a name key, it doesn't actually matter to me that much, because if I want the name in X, I would just do X name, right? And if I want the name in Y, I would want Y. So having the same key in multiple objects doesn't matter. You might be asking, what if we have the same key, multiple of the same keys in the same object? Yep. Oh, sorry, you kind of froze out for a second there. Sorry. Which part? Yep. Because here I specify I go to pushing, right? So, yep. So if I do here, if I do let z equals name, same exact idea, right? I still need to do I'm assigning the value of the key, sorry, the key itself to the variable, and so I access it here, right? It's the same way how if I have an array of 1, 2, 3 and I access it, it's still like, array 1 index 0, right? Like I still need to specify which array's first element I'm looking at. Cool. Yep. Great. And then I guess the other question that is usually asked is, well, what if we have multiple key value pairs in the same object? So what if I have this, and then I have another name down here, and this name is going to be, let's say Trish. And so in JavaScript, the rule of thumb is kind of like in the normal dictionary. You can't have multiple words. You can't have multiple of the same words in a dictionary, right? And so what happens here is if you create something like this, the way that I've created now, the way that JavaScript is going to read this is going to create an object. It's going to create this key value pair called David, and then when it sees this, it will just overwrite the previous key value pair of name David with name Trish. And so this is kind of another fundamental fact of objects in JavaScript, which is that every object can only have a key once. As in, the same key can only exist once in an object. If you try to create too many versions of it, the latest version will always override the previous versions. So, and then just to prove that out, if I do console.logout name, it might actually throw an error. Or no, it doesn't throw an error. Why does it say Tom? Oh, that's because I did X. Do Y. I get Trish, right? Because name David gets created first, but then on the very next line, as JavaScript runs top-down sequentially, name Trish then overrides name David. So every key can only exist once in a JavaScript object. Great. And then this is something that we'll teach you because it's you'll see it kind of in the wild, but I would actually advise you against using this when you're first starting off, because I think it makes things harder, not easier. So programmers tend to be pretty lazy, and so another way to access so what we saw before with these brackets, we call that bracket notation. So we have a bracket and we input a string or a variable that we then access. The other way to access a particular key in an object is to use something called dot notation. And so when I look at line 11, notice how in order to get name, I do pushing. So I still specify the object, but then I do dot name. What that does is it does almost the same thing as a bracket, except notice how there's no quotes around name. This is the other part of object syntax, where whenever you're using dot notation, it basically assumes that whatever is after the dot is going to be a string. So pushing dot name is the same as doing pushing bracket string name, right? And pushing age is pushing bracket string age, and so for color. When we get to line 14, so notice how on line 9 we have a variable called key to check, and we set it equal to the string name. Notice how on line 14, when we do pushing dot key to check, we get back undefined. And the reason for that is because we're using dot notation. It actually looks like key to check and just sees it not as a variable but directly as a string. So it's actually looking for a key in the object, in the pushing object, called literally key to check, not finding it, and it's giving you back an undefined saying, hey, this doesn't exist. And so if you use dot notation, it is shorter, it sometimes looks cleaner, but the downside is you cannot use variables alongside dot notation. If you want to use variables, then you have to use bracket notation, which we covered in the last on the last slide. Any questions here? Like I said, this is meant to be a shortcut. There's nothing that you can do here that you cannot. There's nothing you can do with dot notation that you cannot do with bracket notation. But there are things you can only do with bracket notation. So as you're first starting off, I would actually recommend you use bracket notation just to be kind of safer and more comprehensive. And then as you get more comfortable, feel free to transitioning over to use dot notation. Okay. A few more logistical things. Adding a key value pair in JavaScript is very, very easy. The same way as we do it in a array, really. In order for us to add a value, we just, on lines 10 and 11, we take the object and then using either bracket notation or dot notation, we define the key and then we say equals, and then whatever is after the equal sign basically becomes the value associated with that key. So on line 10, we're saying, hey, in Pusheen, go to the sister key and give it the value of Stormy. If the sister key did not previously exist in the object, then we're going to create it here. And if it did exist previously, then we're going to override whatever value it used to be with this new string called Stormy. Oh, sorry. So after lines 10 and 11 happened, notice how our initial object had 3 key value pairs. Now we have 5 key value pairs. And so this is both how you add a new key value pair as well as override a pre-existing key value pair. And this is literally the same exact thing. So, and then on line 10 there, notice how once we have access to a value, we can also change it, right? So we can do something easy like pushing.age ++, right? Not sure if you're familiar with this, but ++ is essentially like let's say let x equal 6, x ++ is basically equal to x plus or equal 1. There's a little bit more nuance as to why it's not exactly that, but for now we can think of it that way. So in the same way that here we can create a new we can actually override the previous value of 7 with 8. We can also just go in and change that value directly. And here when we do .age, once again, this is the same. This is the same as doing this. Okay. There is a delete keyword in JavaScript, and basically what it does is it allows you to delete both the key and the value. There's no idea of just deleting a value because obviously for a key to exist, it needs to have a value associated with it. So if you want to, replace a previous value with like null or undefined or something else, you just replace the pre-existing key's value with whatever you want it to be. But if you want to remove a key and a value, then the delete keyword is what you want to use. I will say that in general, you will never use the delete keyword. And the reason why is because delete is considered a destructive behavior. And in general, objects are like there's not much use in deleting a key value pair in an object. It's like having a dictionary. If you have a word that you never look up, you don't remove that word from the dictionary. You kind of just ignore it or you never use it. The only times that people realistically would delete a key value pair is for security reasons. So if I'm using an object, I want to pass into another function, but I don't want that function to know. Let's say one of my key value pairs is password, and password is 123. If I don't want whoever I give that object to see that password key value pair, I might delete it. But those are kind of very rare edge cases. In general, we don't delete key value pairs we don't need. We just ignore it. Cool. All right. And then tomorrow's lecture is going to go a lot more into kind of object methods. But now we're going to start thinking about some like the cool use cases of objects, right? So in the same way that our arrays had a .includes function that allows you to check to see if something was a value in the array. A comparable thing also exists for objects. We call it the in operator. So in is also a reserved word in JavaScript. If you type it out, it should show up in different color. And then all it does is if we do name in Pusheen, that's going to give us back a Boolean. Basically what that does is it basically goes into Pusheen objects and checks all the keys and says, is any of the keys name? And there's only 2 possible outcomes. Either it is or it isn't. And so, string in Pusheen or key in object is a really handy way just to make sure if a key value pair actually exists in a given object. And the last thing we're talking about is a little bit tricky. It's definitely the hardest thing in this lesson. Is this idea of a for in loop. So the for we should be familiar with, right? A for loop is what we use to do something, x number of times or a predefined number of times. And the in loop we just talked about, which is a way for us to kind of check to see if something is a key in the object. When I want to go through every element in an array, what I do is, because I know every element is a list and it has a certain number of elements, and the index starts at 0 and goes all the way up. Here, in a very similar vein, what this is doing is saying, if I want to go through every element in an array, I start at the 0th index and I keep going. I keep adding 1 to the index and keep adding 1 to the index. And for every index, I look at the element until I reach the length of my array. With an object, we do something very, very similar, except rather than looking at every index, what we do is we actually go through every single key in the array. So on line 9 there, what the for let key in Pusheen loop is doing is, it actually is in the same way that for a for loop we have let I equal 0. We're creating this tracker, this index variable called key, and we're saying, and what the for loop does for us is it will actually iterate through every single key in Pusheen for us. So when I look at line 10, what that is telling me is saying, for every quote unquote key in Pusheen, print out Pusheen's key is, and then we do Pusheen bracket key the value. Actually, this might be a little bit easier for me to explain if I paste this somewhere else in REPL. Okay, so let's just, I don't think anything up here is particularly useful, so I'm just delete that. Okay, so we're here, right? Actually, let's make this, and let's call it like David's custom key. Okay, just so you can get a sense of how flexible things are. So remember traditionally how if I have an array, the way I use the for loop is I let I equal 0. I is less than array.length, and then I++, and I do my code base, or I do my code. This is the same exact idea here, except now rather than using I can use whatever variable name I want. Typically speaking, people use key. It's more of a convention. You can pick any variable name you want, as you see me do here. And it says let David's custom key in Pusheen. Let's do this. But let's not even do that just yet. Let's just console.log out David's custom key. And then we'll do David's custom key. This is not real code. Okay, so notice how here, what this for loop is doing is it's actually going through the Pusheen object, and it's pulling out every single key for me. It's pulling out name, it's pulling out age, it's pulling out color. A few things to note here. Once again, order in objects should not matter. So in this case, we happen to have gotten it in the same order, like name was created first, so name came out first, and age and color. This is not always necessarily the case. So because order doesn't matter, in this for loop, the only thing I care about is the only knowledge I really need to be certain of is that it's going to give me every single key in the object, but not necessarily the order. So that's the first thing. The second thing is if I want the value of the key, right? So here I have name, but what's the value associated with name? Or rather, let's go with age. Let's say like I want to actually get the value of age. How do I get access to it? Well, here notice how as I loop through this object, I have the key at every single instance. So in order for me to get the value, if I have an object, in this case Pusheen, and then I have the key, which in this case is represented by the variable David's custom key, the way for me to get the value associated with each key is just Pusheen bracket notation David's custom key. Here, once again, remember, I cannot use dot notation because David's custom key is a variable, right? If it's a variable, if I use dot notation, it's going to treat it as a string. But here, when I do this, I'm going to treat it as a variable. And so every time I run through this, on the first run through, the for in loop basically says, "Our Davis custom key, you're the first key I found in the pushing object, which happens to be name." So I console log out name on line 8. And then on the next line, I go to pushing and I say, "By the way, what's the value of the name key?" And I get back pushing. This loop is now done, so I go to the next iteration. The next iteration says, "Are there any other keys in the pushing object?" Yep, there's an age key. Great. Let's go inside here. Let's print it out. Console.log out Davis custom key. I get age. And what's the value of age? It's pushing, accessing the Davis custom key called age. So pushing age is 7. This loop is now done. I go back here again. I say, great, are there any other keys? Yep, there's one more key. It's called color. The value is gray and tabby. I'm done with that. Then I go back in one more time. I say, great, are there any other keys? And at this point, the for loop will tell me, nope, no more keys. You've seen all of them. And so that means I'm now officially gone through every single key in the object. So the for loop is a really good way for you to, it's almost like the way you access every element in an array. The for loop lets you access every single key value pair in an object. The two big things to remind you of here, and you're almost guaranteed to make this mistake, so just know that I said it now, and if you ever are getting stuck, just remember this. This is the key, not the value, right? In the example here, the key is age, the value is 7. In the for loop, this Davis custom key, this is only the key. This is only name, age, and color. You will not have access to the value associated with this key until you go to the object directly, in this case pushing, and access that key's value. Okay, so this is a key, not the value. Those two are very different things. The other thing to also recognize is that the for loop, notice how in a for loop I can actually have very good control over where I start and where I finish. I don't have that measure of control in a for loop. The for loop will go through every single key in the object for me. And so if there's ever an instance in which I don't want to go through every single key in an object, don't use a for loop. All right, the for loop is designed to go through every single key in the object. Now, within the body of my for loop, I can ignore the values I don't want. So I can say, if David's custom key is equals to, name or something else, I can do whatever I want to do. But this does not stop the for loop from still going through every single key value pair in my object. Okay. Any questions on the for loop? All right. In that case, I'll just push through. I think we're almost done here. And then I'll take kind of another round of questions at the end. So here, this is a for loop. This is almost identical to what we just talked about, except now notice how instead of using the appropriate bracket notation on line 10 there, we're doing pushing.key. By using dot notation, we're telling JavaScript is, hey, access the quote-unquote key as a string, as a name, access the key name in your object. So across all 3 iterations of that loop, we're looking for the key name or the value the value associated with the key name in pushing. And because key doesn't exist, then we get back undefined all 3 times. So that's why in the printout we get name is undefined, age is undefined, and color is undefined. And then lastly, this is something that you should know, but you probably shouldn't use too often in the real world. If I want to get just an array of all of the keys in an object, I can use object.keys. And so all I gotta do is pass in an object, and it'll give me back an array. Remember, an array of all of the keys. And this printout is not entirely accurate because all of those name, age, and color, those should all be in quotes because they're all strings. And then similarly, if I want to do it for values, it's just object.values. Same idea. Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about is just like how in an array, I think you probably covered this yesterday with Alec. Um, uh, just like how arrays can be nested, objects can also be nested as well. As in, we can store anything inside of it. We can store we can store other arrays or other objects as values as well. So I'll notice here on line 10, I have my Pusheen object. I'm using dot notation. I pick my colors. Well, Pusheen.colors basically says, give me the value associated with the colors key in Pusheen. Well, the value for the colors key in Pusheen is an array, which has two elements, gray and tabby. And so on line 10, I'm basically saying for that array, let's access index 0, or let's access the first element inside that array, and then let's access the first index or the second element in the array. And so therefore, I'm actually able to access things inside the array as well. This is kind of where JavaScript becomes really powerful, because now you see we can chain things together, right? JavaScript reads from left to right. So here it's on line 10, we're going to Pusheen first, then we're going to Pusheen.colors, and then we're going to Pusheen.colors, whatever that gives back. We're going to go to the index 0, or the first element of whatever that gives back. And then the same exact concept applies to objects as well. So here, if I want to access the sister key in a nested object, and when I say nested object, it just means in Pusheen there's a key called siblings, and the value for that key, for that siblings key, is another object, and that key has its own key and values. If I want to access the variable Stormy, I just do Pusheen.siblings, which gives me back the value for the siblings key, which is an object, and then in that object I do .sister, which gives me back the value for the sister key in the inner object, and I get back Stormy and Pip. And that should be it. Okay, any questions? Quite a bit of stuff. First half maybe reviewed. The second half probably more newer things. But any questions here? Cool. I'll take that to mean that everyone gets this. All right, then. I will start you off on your workshops.